Okay, I was confronted with a puzzle and I sought the pieces. I have not found them all, and of some of those I share with you today, you may only get a glimpse. But the outline of the figure in the puzzle seems fairly clear to me, and I hope that you will recognize it too. The great student of mythology, Joseph Campbell, wrote a book entitled The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I hope too that you will be able to recognize in the image I offer yourselves. The goal of this essay is to explicate and add consideration to Jeffrey Rubinoff's statement that art is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is proof of the journey. As the artist navigates the unknown, the art adds the collective memory. The essay starts with the premise that the Jungian term collective unconscious is a good entry point for understanding Rubinoff's concept of human soul. Rubinoff also used the term collective memory, which has a great deal of overlap with the concept of the collective unconscious. This conceptual agreement between Jung and Rubinoff lends support to the idea that the term human soul denotes not a series of singular souls inhabiting bodies, but a collective soul, embodied in a collective memory. The essay further explores in some detail and from some perspective of various disciplines how our perceptions of isolated individualness is in fact a fantasy. What is more supported by thinkers in a variety of disciplines is that even what we might normally consider individual consciousness is itself dependent upon, embedded in, and stores collective consciousness. Lastly, it investigates and applies the work of other thinkers to Rubinoff's proposition that art is a method for mapping the collective memory of the human soul. For Rubinoff, art is truth by metaphor, and the essay utilizes prior thinking on the subject of metaphor to provide a finer gradation and understanding of Rubinoff's mapping mechanism. Jeffrey Rubinoff wrote, "Art is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is proof of the journey. As the artist navigates the unknown, the art adds the collective memory." Beethoven wrote, "I do not create this music. I only try as best I can to write down what I hear." Philip Glass said, "The hardest thing is just to hear and then to get it down right." I consider the space thus being mapped by art and by music corresponds to what Jung called the collective unconsciousness. Do painters and sculptors and composers realize in their work an internal vision of the collective unconscious? And the poets and the writers? Is that which is expressed in all the arts of mankind both unique to the artist and universal to all of us? Is the unique merely a singular window on the universal human soul, from which a particular region of our shared internal landscape is expressed? The conventional attitude and belief in modern Western culture is that we're all individuals, essentially separate in our bodies, our minds, our hearts, emotions, and our souls. Born alone, we die alone, yearning ever for connection. However, there exists evidence that this attitude of individual isolation, this belief, is not characteristic of all human societies, but is an element of certain types of culture, most notably the rational technological culture from which grew industrial society. However, this paper will not discuss either the origins of individualism nor alternatives to it that may exist in other cultures. Rather, it shall present a view of an alternative to this insular individualism, an alternative derived from various thinkers and scientific researchers within Western industrial society. I call this alternative perspective on the self the Peninsular Individual, following John Donne, who wrote, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. The geographical metaphor in Don gives me guidance in how to proceed with my interrogation. My exploration of this alternative perspective. Maps and navigation are key elements of this guidance, which is reinforced by Rubinoff's statement above. Don's continent is the human soul. As a metaphor, this implies numerous exemplifications: the human spirit, the collective unconscious, the human mind, the human body, the human genome, human experience, human behavior, social structure, culture, the works of humankind, art, technology, patterns of residence, subsistence strategies, types of economies, political systems, etc. Metaphor itself is a means of mapping and of navigation. I will offer here several maps which I think indicate overlapping regions. What is the dialectical relationship constituting individual minds and group mind? A dialectical relationship is a relationship of opposition and interdependence, kind of like inside-outside. They're opposites, and yet you can't have one without the other. They depend upon each other for their very existence. Inside-outside is a pretty good metaphor for the relationship between individual minds and group mind, in a variety of ways, with a bit of paradox thrown in for good measure. Individual minds are contained by group mind, as group mind is composed of individual minds. And yet group mind itself is an idea contained within individual minds, a dialectical relationship. You see, in the simplest, most simple-minded sense, individual mind and group mind are opposites and are in opposition. The individual mind is sometimes conceived of as threatened by the existence of group mind. As in mass psychology, or the mindless mind of the crowd, in which the individual may become submerged de-individualized, deprived of her individuality, of her identity. I was out of control, caught up in mass hysteria. The devil made me do it. By the way, I use here H-I-R as a substitute for him and her. Or, I had to distinguish myself from the rest of the group, show I was different, my own person, not like everybody else, a real individual. Compare Wolfenpai and an individual in your groups. And then you hear everyone saying the same thing. Strange. I am a distinct autonomous individual, chanted in unison by a mass of such individuals. Everyone agrees, has the same thought, but everyone having the same thought is one definition of group mind. Right there is an aspect, a dimension of the dialectical relationship. Now, common culture, a shared language, a system of beliefs and values and aesthetic forms or preferences is a kind of group mind. It is a container, a substrate, a body of resources without which no individual mind could possibly exist. And it is the medium by means of which, a diversity of individual minds is capable of communicating with one another. In fact, we might be able fairly to say that it is only in the communication between individual minds via the group mind that any individual mind can exist. That's a meaning of how dialectical relationship constitutes individual minds and group mind. But to look at it yet another way, here we are, right now, several individual minds thinking about group mind. The idea of group mind is in each of our individual minds. And if we posit a group mind for this particular group, then that mind of which we individually are parts has its existence in each of its parts. Is it a kind of a hologram or a kind of a fractal? Group mind, individual mind on this reading is a holographic entity. In another way, can an individual mind exist without a culture, without a language? Does a culture-free, a language-free animal have a mind? Or does the language, which is of necessity shared among a group, instantiated in the distinct body-based perspective of a single body, thus actually constitute the mind of that body, that perspective, that individual. Another meaning of how dialectical relationship constitutes individual minds and group minds. I am the conversation I am having with myself about how things seem to be from where I stand. Aside, the discipline of meditation is directed toward engaging the individual perspective as actor in silencing individual self as running narrative in order to allow that perspective to be aware of its ground in the universal self. And language can only speak of such things by means of paradox, circularity, and silence. Biologically, humans are pack animals, herd animals like wolves or buffalo, not solitaries like bears. We're each born into a family upon which we are utterly dependent for our survival for at least the first years of life. We are born immature, incomplete, only partly human, extrauterine embryos. We only become fully human through years of socialization, of acculturation. The self of the human being emerges slowly in the first 2 to 5 years at a minimum. Only with the development of sufficient communicative skill with language can it be said that the human child starts to have a self, to become a psychological individual. And evidence can be found to support the proposition that psychological individual is an attribution less fairly made to a member of a primitive, illiterate, band or tribal-based cultures than to a modern, rational, industrial, urban society member, a citizen and a consumer. The initiation, for example, of a tribal youth into his totem clan individualizes him only as one more instantiation of the clan's totem spirit, individualized as one among many who are identically emanations of that same spirit. Jung's idea of archetypes resonates with this point. The individuated self is an extruded instantiation of the collective unconscious. We are all avatars. Freud claimed that the infant child only psychologically separates out from the primordial mother-child unity, only begins to be born psychologically by means of a complex process of appetite and attraction and frustration and hostility. A metaphorical gestalt of biting and chewing and swallowing, which includes the crucial step of getting the idea of a possible separate from mother existence by observation of the father as another mother, and thus as an introjected seed crystal of the infant's separated self. Freud saw this process as psychomythically revealed in the narrative of Oedipus. Melanie Klein reconfigured this model in more objective, less overtly mythical detail via her object relations narrative. And she saw the mother, the initial caretaker, as the initial seed crystal. Following Klein, Wilfred Bion read the object relations narrative as a containment metaphor. Compare the container schema analyzed by Lakoff and Johnson as a primary metaphor. The psychiatrist Daniel Siegel, proposing an interpersonal neurobiology, has reviewed findings from a wide range of scientific disciplines in exploring the idea that the mind develops at the interface between human relationships and the unfolding structure and function of the brain. The relationship between individual and collective is one of re-entry or re-entrancy. One is in the other, and the other is in the one. Metaphor bears two types of meaning. One is rhetorical metaphor, a figure of speech, in which a word or phrase applies to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. A rhetorical metaphor is a play on words, a relatively superficial trick of language. The other meaning is conceptual metaphor, which refers to the understanding of one idea in one conceptual domain in terms of another idea in another domain. Conceptual metaphor is a means of thinking, perhaps the most basic such means, revealing the constitutive structure of the target domain as informed by or dependent upon the structure of the source domain. In Rubinoff's quote, I take map, navigate, collective, and soul to be conceptual metaphors, not rhetorical ones. I also take truth by metaphor to be truth by conceptual metaphor. Metaphor is a means of mapping and thus of navigation. Metaphor helps us find our way around in the previously unrealized spaces so mapped. It is my presumption in this paper that all metaphors, even in the sense of rhetorical metaphors, are essentially cognitive metaphors. That the mapping of elements from a source domain onto a target domain is the core characteristic, the central dynamic or process of metaphoric words, metaphoric thoughts, and metaphoric images and other such constructions into the physical world. I consider this insight into the deep nature of metaphor to be a paradigm-creating insight for the understanding of how art works, for how art communicates, and perhaps for how, following another of Rubinoff's insight, metaphor is active in history. My focus, however, shall primarily and initially be on words and thoughts rather than on artworks or on metaphors as active in history. A major source of my ruminations on metaphor, and thus of my attempt to describe the emergence, construction, growth, development, and use in daily life of individual selfhood, is a book written by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson called Philosophy in the Flesh, The Embodied Mind and Its Challenge to Western Thought. At the core of their undertaking is the intention to intake an empirically responsible philosophy, which is a philosophy consistent with empirical discoveries about the nature of mind. The story might be seen to begin with two neurological systems in the brain, the sensory-motor subsystem and the abstract subjective subsystem. The infant human does not, for its survival, initially need much, if any, of either abstract experience or subjective experience. It does need, however, to coordinate its sensory-motor system with its body in the physical world. So initially, the sensory-motor subsystem begins functioning most quickly and continues most rapidly to develop to extend its range and complexity of coordinating incoming information and outgoing control. The brain's management of the afferent and efferent nervous systems. The sensory-motor system has an immediate need for effective structure. Some of the structure seems to be provided genetically and instinctively, that is, evolved with this kind of body in this kind of world. But of course, both systems begin to develop immediately. In fact, evidence indicates that they share information as they develop, that signals pass between them. But the needs and development and data structuring of the sensory-motor system predominates. In fact, the structure of the sensory-motor mental domain is effectively biased toward the organism's need to manipulate the particular shaped body it has in the particularly structured physical environment in which it finds itself. That need and that body environment set of possibilities constrain the structures of the sensory-motor mental domains. Now, as the abstract subjective experience neurosystem develops, as its neurons extend and make new connections, it does so in dynamic interaction with the sensory-motor system. Consequently, the cognitive structure of the abstract subjective experience neurosystem establishes most easily in congruence with the cognitive structure of the sensory-motor system. The abstraction subjective self-experience develops as a set of metaphors mapped from the sensory-motor system. The I is not the simple unitary entity we normally experience it to be. It is a landscape we pass through over time. Experiencing each moment as singular, even though a diversity of influences and conditions and states characterize the course of that experience. Postmodern and feminist philosophers refer to an intersectional self. That idea is similar to, but not identical with, the present view. Each moment we perceive and identify and act out of the state and condition and influence of that moment, quickly passing on to another, forgetting or eliding or denying the difference between momentary eyes. Past eyes leave a residue, which supports the illusion of the unitary eye. Influences and conditions and states fade in and out, creating the illusion of the unitary I. I am motivated to act and to perceive, to think and to believe, and consciously to value by the confluence with external events of three kinds of internal motives. There are needs, cognitions, and emotions. Needs include the physiological needs for food, water, air, etc., as well as organismic, psychological, developmental needs for self-determination, competence, and relationship with others. Needs and emotions may move us independently of conscious awareness, while cognitions, goals, beliefs, self-concept, values, decision processes usually have their effect via conscious awareness, but sometimes condition our choices unconsciously. Our behavioral and perceptual response to the convergence of internal needs and emotions with external events is largely, though not completely, conditioned by past experience. Behavior and perception are largely learned. Cognitions as well, perhaps even more so, are aggregated and patterned by learning. Most human learning occurs in the presence of and with the active participation of other humans. The influence of other humans on why, what, and how we do what we do, perceive what we perceive, believe the world to be as we believe it to be, is immense. The influence of others from infancy through adolescence into adulthood is primarily, if not absolutely, determinative of what and who each of us is, both through time, the course of our daily lives, and in the depths of our identities, of our souls. We are thereby each a multitude. No human is an island, single, whole, and separate from all others. Each of us is a promontory, a peninsula, a piece of the main. In this paper, I discuss some of the ways in which we are inherently united with others, ways in which we are formed out of the gifts of self that are presented to us over the course of our lives, and ways in which we reveal to ourselves and to others the lineaments of multiplicity that compose each unitary face. I offer evidence from psychoanalytic theory, from psychology, from neurobiology, and from linguistics. The core of the thesis that has emerged from my materials is that our individual identities are constructed or grown out of three basic elements. Our shared mental structure based on our shared evolved genome, the bits and pieces of self-concept, of self-definition that are provided to us by our infantile and childhood caretakers and by the others with whom we interact as we proceed through the course of our lives. The cultural norms, rules for self and group identity or identification in the societies and communities and groups in which we carry on the course of those lives. Especially in this latter regard, and partly involved in two. Individuality, as we normally conceive it today, is a consensual fiction, provided for us or imposed on us by the rational culture of Western industrial society. In truth, we are each no more separate from our communities, our groups, our societies, from each other, than is a peninsula from the mainland of which it is an apparently protruding appendage. Part of this conceptual fiction involves the early learning, or inventing, or imagining, or realizing of the idea of self as separate from other. Individual and group, in a sense, are both equally fantasies. Mental constructs made up of linguistic, symbolic materials. The privileged reality of the individual is an element of current Western culture. We have a habit of attention that focuses our normal, usual consciousness on the subject, self-referent of I. We'll constantly meditate on that. Some evidence suggests that the usual consciousness of mankind over most of its history and prehistory focused instead on the we of group fantasy. This implies that the normal prehistoric consciousness was basic assumption states, as developed by Wilfred Bion. This is a notion I have. First of all, I do find myself unable to imagine any human mind that is not emergent from a single biological brain, at least within current scientific knowledge. A group mind based on, say, radio-like connections between individual brains is science fiction. I'm trying to think within science, not within science fiction. Okay, we can't point to a group mind, and we can't imagine in current science a physical basis for such a thing. However, we can neither point to an individual mind, although we can imagine in current science a physical basis for one. Also, we are accustomed to talking about individual minds. We are accustomed to talking about ourselves as individual minds. It is the normal, proper, conventional way to talk about ourselves and each other. It is what we usually do, and doing it accords with the current rules for how properly to refer to the experiences and the phenomena that individual mind refers to and summarizes. Since we cannot point to individual mind, I propose that individual mind functions in common discourse in exactly the same way that any theoretical construct functions in scientific discourse. Electrons, quasars, light waves, etc. The phrase individual mind summarizes a coherent set of empirical observations, unifying them with each other on the basis of a coherent set of theoretical, explanatory, cross-level binding assertions, laws, hypotheses. Theoretical construct is thus a subcategory of fantasy, an imagined thing. Additionally, I am taken with the idea, which is Freud's idea, that psychologically a group is always a fantasy, an image held in an individual mind, in a set of individual minds. It's a different mind, a different concept, with a different sense and possibly a different referent than sociological group, which latter can be operationalized in terms of number and kinds of interactions among individuals, and that sort of thing. Furthermore, individual minds always consist both of individual body-based experience and of cultural constructs. Individual minds cohere around some cultural, often language-based, perhaps always language-based, seed crystal. Such seed crystals, it seems to me, are always shared among a community of humans. I find support in this notion from object relations theory, specifically from the process by which an infant constructs a self-object in interaction with parents. I see the mother-child object slowly being differentiated into mother and self-objects, on a model, perhaps, of father as separate from mother. Klein, though, and Merleau-Ponty propose that the mother object provides the first model for the distinct self-object. Here's the notion I wish to clarify here. The mother-child object is the initial basic assumption group. It's a long story from Wilfred Bion, which I won't elaborate here. Psychologically, it is a fantasy, an imaginary thing in the mind of the infant, an imaginary thing in the mind of the mother. Minds made up of sensations, feelings, ideas, symbols. Very primitive and undifferentiated in both individual minds, especially the infant's. Infant and mother are an unconscious confluence. Together, in each of the two individual minds, there is initially only a single mother-child object. Second point of clarification. Cultural elements are crucial, constitutive components of minds. No individual mind can exist without a framework consisting of cultural components. Isolated human minds, isolated from birth, cannot, on this interpretation, exist. There is no such thing in reality. No non-social, totally without culture, human mind can possibly exist. Isolated at birth from any human caregiver, no infant Homo sapiens can become a mind, a human being. Without interaction with others, there is no soul. This idea is presumably contrary to Judeo-Christian theological beliefs. And the potential for mindedness deteriorates if unused. The first years are critical for the formation of the mind and the self. Third point, cultures are relative. Cultures change over time and across space. A culture only exists within the confines of a sufficiently intensely interaction population of human beings. It is probably helpful to our understanding to say that at some point in time, one culture has evolved into a different culture. Different cultures are quite likely, yes, to contain different individual mind seed crystals. Consequently, The individual bearers of different cultures are likely to have different kinds of individual minds, different kinds of soul. Fourth point. Individual is a highly valued, highly elaborated, thoroughly grounded in individual bodies idea in the culture of modern industrial society. This current cultural convention, a rule that we think of action as originating from individual minds located in individual bodies. Intention in ethics, intention in linguistics focuses on, stems from this convention. Individual agency has cultural priority over societal agency. Fifth point. Perhaps early human cultures placed less emphasis on individual origination of action, on the individual. Perhaps the basic assumption states were more pervasive in previous societies, especially in prehistoric times. Some work, for example, Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, presents evidence to the effect that the members of ancient societies were in a trance for much of their lives. Some current commentators claim that the present-day normal state of consciousness is also a trance state, a different trance state, as do the mystics of Eastern religions. Perhaps to allow us to at least act in some sort of harmony, coordination of the primitive human band on a non-instinctive basis is the survival value that explains the emergence of basic assumption state group minds, from which over many millennia, individual mind is still evolving. I, as an individual member of groups, keep my fingers crossed that the individual mind has at least as much survival value in the present and future planetary ecosystem as group mind apparently has had over the vast and continuing past of our species. Jung's concept of individuation may be pertinent at this point. PowerPoint's not showing anymore. Next is the soul. The PowerPoint says, this is a dispatch from the dream time, the place the Australian Aborigine believes is a reality in some manner superior to objective waking reality. The dreaming, the everwhen, Jung's pleroma, Heidegger's womb of mnemosyne. This is an exploration of the notion that all humans share a single soul. The human soul is a phrase that oscillates in meaning between the singular inflection and the collective. My soul, our soul, the soul. This paper is a study of that oscillation. The human individual, each human individual, is both a particle and a wave in the genetic and mental body of the collectivity, the species, the culture. All humans share a single soul, the soul of mankind. But what can this be? In common discourse, each person has her own soul. In metaphysical or inspirational discourse, a people may have a soul. A nation or a religion or an ethnicity may have a soul. Tracy Kidder wrote a book called The Soul of a New Machine, about the team effort to invent a new kind of computer. The semantics of the word is ambiguous. Does it have an empirical or literal meaning or only an abstract meaning? A metaphorical meaning? What does soul denote? Or is there no denotation, only connotative meaning? Is there a referent? What is its sense? Or does the use of soul have primarily performative meaning? Is its meaning essentially pragmatic, indicative of a relationship between its addressor and addressee? Is it less a marker than a move? The stance I take in these ruminations is that the biophysical medium, the human body, which is the necessary condition of all our life and of all our experience, constitutes a structuring basis for all experience, and that the genetic universality of that body-brain system in its relation to the biophysical world within which and in adaptation with which results in a single potential experience base for all human beings. That experience base is the collective unconscious, the cognitive unconscious. Art is the map of that human soul, the internal, intuitive reality of the collective human memory. The stance I take in addition is that the experience of being an individual is a cultural experience, bonded to both an infantile mother-child group membership and emergent peer and adult group memberships. What it means to each of us to be an individual depends upon the particular culture of which we partake and the groups of which we are members. Even Freud believed that the very basis of individual psychology is the relationships with others that each of us experiences. The neurologically constrained potential experience base is the human soul. It is what we can share cognitively and emotionally. What we do share, in spite of any current cultural rules denying such sharing. The insular individual and the peninsular individual. The isolated, autonomous individual is a fiction which has nourished a materialistic egoism, starved the human need for community, and artificially invigorated religious fanaticism as a means of assuaging the pains caused by that fiction. The image is beloved of free market ideologues, hell-fearing evangelists, apologists of pirate capitalism, and many successful, self-made people who nonetheless, all unawares, depend utterly upon the society and community and other people for their success. Increasingly, in the 20th century, the modernist notion of the self as unitary, stable, and transparent has come under criticism. Among the major critiques of that culturally privileged conception are postmodernist and feminist critiques. While the peninsular individual conception shares some features with those, I do not in this paper treat of those positions at all systematically. Furthermore, the view explored here differs from most of those others in its explicit commitment to being empirically responsible. The critique in this paper is transgressive as a method, in a different register than those critiques are transgressive. Among philosophers, Martin Heidegger had the insight that the Enlightenment vision of the self as a free and autonomous individuality that develops as unique to each of us, and that develops as part of our spontaneous encounter with the world as a superficial illusion perpetrated on us by Descartes and the philosophers he influenced. And Nietzsche insists that the unity of Descartes' subject as the cause of mental and other acts cannot be presupposed. The will, ego, or I is a unity only in word. There does exist another contrary image, although an alternative narrative, but it is not as it has been recognized, envisioned, and articulated often in recent cultural history, but it is not as clear-cut, as distinct as is the icon of isolated individualism. We might call it grounded individuation. It is not strictly communalism, although some flavors of it may be called that. I'm sketching out this image here as the peninsular individual, put together roughly out of several parts. The parts themselves are not separate from each other, and some are inclusive of others. The interplay between Lakoff-Johnson's theory of conceptual metaphor and Bayon's theories of containment and linking provides the storyline of the efficacy of metaphor for understanding the collective nature of the human self. The core structure of this narrative is the reciprocal mapping between the universally shared sensory motor neural system, the abstract individual experience neurosystem, and the other. The other is a domain that exists jointly, both intra-psychically and externally, as both the multiplicity of human embodiments, other people, and as the culture shared among the members of the societal system. The other exists both inside each of us and outside us in the socio-cultural space we share and which we together constitute. In the Freudian story of psychogenesis, of the emergence of self and the experience of the infant and her mother, recounted slightly differently by Freud and by Klein and by Bayon, can be found an utter reliance on metaphor, which is the merging of spatial, temporal, and direct body function elements. We must acknowledge here that the discourse being described exists initially in the imaginations of our authors. The structures of these discourses, as they are hypothetically projected, as descriptive of the experience of the infant and empathetically of her mother, consists of the components of these metaphors. In using these metaphors, the authors are attempting to reproduce, to represent the infant's experience. For all three of these authors, perhaps most explicitly for Bion, the essential character of the experience in question is that it is a feeling experience. It is uncertain whether emotion is an additional or integral component of feeling experience. Clarity is probably best served by considering emotion to be an additional layer, interpretive layer on top of the bare feelings. Although naming the feelings can perhaps not avoid emotion labels. Feeling is a potentially, functionally coherent set of sensations of internal body states. Muscular tension, relaxation, chemical composition of the blood, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. Antonio Damasio wrote, I conceptualize the essence of feelings as something you and I can see through a window that opens directly onto a continuously updated image of the structure and state of our body. Here, the border between the known and the unknown, language is incapable of describing with precision and objectivity what is beyond the border. Speech stumbles into the lands of the abyss, dances into the darkness feebly or heroically, trying by means of the spark striking from its feet to illuminate, to reveal a picture of what is here. Art is the map of the human soul. It is truth by metaphor. What I've tried to do here is piece together in your minds a mosaic made up of the ideas, the words of several thinkers, several other explorers of this particular region of the unknown. I see an image in that mosaic. I hope to assist you to see it too, in the aggregation of these bits and pieces of maps. I didn't know where to start, or I could have started almost anywhere. This is not a linear narrative, not yet a coherent argument. Rather, it is an image built up in the imagination using a variety of distinct yet deeply connected separate narratives. In coming to understand this view of the self, I've collected the work of several authors. This method corresponds approximately to what is called in the sciences confirmation by convergent evidence. This convergence in a broader sense is also called consilience. What I've called in my title the Peninsular Individual is sometimes called the socially constructed self. This is the hypothesis that deep in the mind, in the soul of every individual, the others with whom we live are component parts. Each of us is the multitude. The bell tolls for you. My last slide says, maps of the human soul, truth by metaphor, it tolls for thee. Thank you.
I want to thank Jerry for coming and struggling through that. I know you've got a cough and that's tough to have a 40-minute presentation, but thank you for making it through. Those words are ones we all were waiting to hear and interested in. So I'm going to turn over the floor to Jeff Foss, who has been assigned to do a reading and lead off the dialogue with questions and comments. And again, I just wanted to remind you that we'll start with observations that perhaps lead into questions so that there can be dialogue. And we'll start with the table, and then I'll invite at some point any questions from the floor. And if you do have them, you can just raise your hand. So, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so my question is going to be directly to the issue that the issue. The imaginary focus that I tried to present for us of becoming Gaia's mind. And on one hand, Jerry and I are fellow travelers. On one hand, he's saying, yes, the individual mind is a kind of an illusion. The group mind is the basic reality. So, all right, okay. I like that, and there's a lot of things I like about it, and I'm just going to mention a couple things in passing. I am leading to the question. I mean, one thing, I'm very fond of the studies of feral children, of which, unfortunately, there are a great many these days, particularly in the former Yugoslavia, where you can access quite a few studies. I welcome you all to Google it. It's a politically incorrect term. You're not supposed to call them feral children, which means literally wild children, but I am absolutely convinced some kids are raised by dogs and turn into dogs. Dogs, in all ways, dogs are dogs. They howl at the moon, and they can smell things that we can't smell, and they walk on their toes. And so, anyways, there's a lot of evidence that this is true. We are programmable. We are, as I call, point of view shifters. We can do this. One one other thing, Julian Jaynes. I first thought that's crazy, nonsense, and then there's every brilliant book. I recommend it to everybody, Julian Jaynes' story. And I think what he's trying to do is describe software history, which is hard to recover from the brain. But he's saying there was a time when we thought as a group. And I think essentially his story is that we thought as a group when we were in small groups. Now let me bring to this notion of yours, okay? I'm going to come closing on this if I can quickly. You say a group mind based on, say, radio-like connections between individual brains is science fiction, and I go, dagger to the heart. Now, it's okay in a way, because I need a dagger to the heart, and Jerry is a dialectical thinker. He's not going to stay on one side or the other of this issue, and I think it's brilliant. But let me come back at where you begin to fear for the loss of individuality, okay? Because I think this is a legitimate fear, and I think the individual is a beautiful creation. And what Julian Jaynes describes is group minds, and this is one, I would say. We are a group mind. If you want to say, okay, what is the reality? You say, there's no physical basis for the group mind. I say, yes, there is. Here's the physical basis. We are a group mind. We are processing information. People do this all the time. It's not unusual. We get together and we solve a problem. We call them committees. We call them whatever you like. We process information. We deal with the problem. A ship comes into shore, a great big battleship of the U.S. Navy. Today's Rome. Hundreds of people are watching this thing, taking sightings and so on. We do things this way. We coordinate our information processes and do things collectively that we cannot do as individuals, whether it's a rocket launch or indeed a conference. Okay, so there is a body, and it's our bodies, and we do it. We process information in these other structures. You're afraid of the loss of individuality. So what Julian Jaynes' story is roughly is that when we began to form agricultural communities, civilizations, this broke down. We could no longer talk to each other. And we began to use force and violence and all manner of ways to get people to toe the line. We began to invent religions. We began to make totems. We began to all sorts of things to get people on track, keep them on track, give them definitions, start up trade guilds. So it's been a long story. So when you say this individualism is associated with industrialism, with right-wing values and so on, and I suppose there's some truth to that. This repost that you, this double-barreled view you have the individual. On one hand, you say, I don't like it. A creature of the right, the result of our hard-heartedness, creator of our hard-heartedness, and so on. On the other hand, it's I don't want to be lost as an individual, and the group mind, right? This is the tension I would like you to speak to with a view to what you see as the potential of a group mind approximating, dare I say, something like a planetary nervous system.
Sure. Shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah, and will you be lost in it? Should we fear loss?
That's why I say peninsular individual. That's why I think that Jung's idea of individuation may be the way. The individuated person for Jung is someone who retains her individuality, her distinct identity, and yet has gotten over his denial of unity with the group. That's the point. The point is the connection of the peninsula to the continent. The current ideology is of the individual and insular individual. We're separate from the collective body. But the peninsular individual is both distinct and joined.
Is Hitler an avatar?
Yeah, sure.
What does that tell us about
Yeah, he's an awful image of one of ourselves. And I can only...
Do we punish him as an individual?
I can only understand him by identifying with him. Punishment is, wow.
That's one reason we have individuals, so we know who to blame.
These days, yes. But you see, punishment, blame, morality is a social phenomenon. It's a structure. It's an element of structure. It is. I'll go out on a limb here. It's it's a means for a society of insular individuals to emulate a continent. I imagine, I can't say I believe, I hope, I envision a different kind of system of social control that isn't the same as the unconscious social control of the band, of the group mind, nor is the same as the isolated kind of social control of industrial society. The Committees of Peace and Reconciliation in South Africa were very much concerned with not imposing justice. Reconciliation is not justice. Reconciliation is possibly the kind of social control that transcends blame and morality. Blame and punishment and justice are things we invented so that we could exist as a society of insular individuals at all. And I think while justice is beautiful, it's only a transition. So, blame is, if we know that we are one, we don't blame each other. Because blame is a means of controlling people. Punishment is a means of, and it's based on a primitive kind of psychology of motivation that isn't really the way humans function.
I have a question, and then I'll get back to one of yours. How do you relate the Peninsular Individual to your state where you started, which is art as a map of the human soul? I'd like you to relate that concept to the theme of the symposium. I have my own ideas of how it would relate, but I'd like to hear from you.
The artist in the modern world is very much an individual. The artist in the ancient world may not have been. The artist in the modern world obtains her greatest capability for realizing art from the dialectic between separateness and the jointedness. When an artist isolates from the group and goes into his own experience, my theory argues that where he's going is to where we all are anyway.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to make that clear a little bit more.
Yeah, that's how the work of art is a map of the human soul. We resonate with the work of art. The viewer says, "Oh, yes, I get it," because I'm there too.
I'm still not buying your postulation that previously artists were not, or that artists either are individuals or are not. I'm not quite clear.
Well, I don't know about how they were in the ancient world. Maybe they.
I just don't know either.
Yeah.
But
But anyway, now they are.
And okay, we'll leave that for now. Jeff, I'll let you get back to any other questions or comments.
Oh, gee. That was brilliant, Jerry.
Thank you.
Okay. Theoretical construct is thus a subcategory of fantasy, quote unquote. And I'm glad there's at least some quotes around that, because you dropped acid, right?
Everyone has.
All right.
No.
Okay, I want to talk to everybody here that's dropped acid. I want to talk to everybody here. When I was a child, I was a spontaneous mystic. I would melt away. Maybe some of you remember that too. The older I get, the harder it is to get there. But acid gave me a boost. And fantasy is the notion of something that's completely unreal. It is Harry Potter told on a Sunday afternoon. It is watched on TV. That's a fantasy in a sense that has no connection with reality. A fantasy, in another way, is the world that you see every day, right? Now, sometimes, of course, you can go so far away you don't know where you are. But I mean, you're looking at the very same world in a different way. What is it to see the world through a fantasy? I mean, the fact is, a biological organism can only perceive, whether it's a worm or whatever it is, by building in itself a construct. Its own body must be altered by the world around it in such a way that the alterations contain information about the external world. For a worm, it's simple. Forward or reverse. Do I eat through this, or do I back up? Eat through something else, right? But that is an extremely complicated computation, and it requires something changing in the worm as a result of something outside. This thing that we create in ourselves, we can call it a fantasy if we like, but I think that's only when it ceases to be focused on the world. Even, it seems, what is it to see through a fantasy? What is it to see through a theory? What is it to see? Well, this because you're talking about these structures, these motor structures. Motor structures, right? This.
Yeah, I don't
what was that thing you slipped into my ear? Say, oh, metaphor is based upon motor.
Oh, yeah, all words are metaphors.
What's this?
I don't use fantasy to mean unreal fantasy. A fantasy is a imaginary construct. And it may or may not, in one degree or another, correspond to physical reality. But it is imaginary construct regardless.
This correspond bothers me. Ever since we've got these forms that you're supposed to match, why not interact with? Why not be love?
You're a philosopher.
I hate to break it off, but we're diverging too far. Okay. Sorry, Jeff, we're diverging too far from what I think, and I know you, since you're a philosopher, you love to get into the finer details. But I'm going to bring us back to what I think is one of the core aspects that does relate to the purpose of the form, which is the idea of the collective unconscious as the human soul. And one of the things that I'd like you to, what I want to ask Sam actually is, Jerry talks about the genetic sort of base for the potential experience of the collective unconscious. So there's a genetic base for it. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of a biologist, zoologist, now he's gone as far as to give credit to the nature versus nurture. He's to the nature part of it to the extent that at least every human being has the same potential, and so there's a degree of universality there. But to me, what I'm wondering is, does our genetic heritage of the last however many million, 100,000, or 10,000 years, or whatever you want to call it, does that actually impinge on our human soul and actually structure it in a way that's a little less potential and a little more actual?
I would say definitely.
Can you give us an example of that?
There's been now tons of genes associated with things like schizophrenia and different conditions. And so, there's genetic variation for all sorts of things that are related to the way that minds work. And so there's definitely variation that's just segregating in the population. Some people have different copies of different genes, and that affects the way that your mind works. And so there's definitely, at that level, it's not clear exactly how they work, but there's definitely lots of evidence for genes doing things to the way that minds work, and a lot of variation in that. And so I think the fact that there is so much variation, that means that there's plenty of variation and constraint, and there's not equal potential with everybody, I think that's, certainly from a genetic perspective, I think that's pretty clear.
Jerry, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to?
Yeah, I know there's some evidence in support of this view. A little bit. We're waiting for more.
To me, that's an enormous fault line within sociology, that because your whole profession is based on, and I'm a sociology minor, so I'm speaking from absolutely no knowledge, that there's a definite denial of the agency, or of not the agency, I suppose, of the salience or even effect of, or interest in the genetic and biological basis, right? Because of the professional bias.
No interest, totally ignores
Yeah.
it, ignores it, just ignores it.
The bottom line is that if you believe in evolution, then we've come from chimpanzees somehow. And if you've evolved from chimpanzees or like a chimpanzee ancestor somehow, then there must have been variation in the underpinnings of the brain, like the brain that evolved from chimpanzees to humans, because that evolution is done by natural selection on variation. And so if there was variation back then to get to where we are now, then stands to reason there's still plenty of variation out there. And I mean, I think that's just, even if we didn't have any evidence for it, I think you'd almost just axiomatically have to say that there's still variation out there for it, even if we hadn't found it. And there's plenty of evidence for it, I would say, at this point.
Yeah, Brian. And then you. Hold on, Brian was section.
No, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry, okay. Two minor points. I want to get back to the artist as individual or not. In terms of the variations, just what you said, just made me wonder, presuming we came from chimpanzees, we display more variety than chimpanzees socially. I would say that the chimpanzee is much less aware of itself versus the group, though there is still an awareness that chimpanzee will grab that banana for itself. But they function within a pack of chimpanzees that works together, swinging through the trees and going where the pack goes. I'm wondering, is that individualization just a function of the genetic variance that has brought us this far? Like, is the rise of the sense of being an individual, does it have a basis in genetic mutation that has been created from evolution? In other words, that we have certain talents and certain characteristics based on possibly genetic bases, or even flaws like schizophrenia, if you want to call it a flaw. I'm not trying to be pejorative, but based upon certain genetic components that are inherent within each of us. But is it built as a fan? Is it just we have more and more variation?
I have a lot of trouble with I don't at all have a good answer for that, because I don't know where you start developing consciousness, where you start developing a mind. I mean, is there a point where it just suddenly begins? And I mean, I think that there's some evidence for a limited theory of mind in elephants and some other animals where they recognize their image in a mirror in a way that suggests that they're aware of it being something other than just another elephant. And
I had a cat that would recognize my image in a mirror.
yeah.
I have a very large mirror in my practice room, and I had a cat that used to sort of sit in this room practice, and she'd be over there. And sometimes I'd turn to talk to her, and she wouldn't be looking at me. And then I'd glance back at the mirror, and I'd realize she was making eye contact with me in the mirror.
But that's
So she wouldn't look at me when I talk to her. She'd look at the mirror, and we'd have a whole conversation. She'd be looking at me, we'd be looking here. Yet she was there, and I was there, and we'd be having a nice little, "How are you doing, kitty?" Meow.
I think that's interesting. I don't think that says necessarily anything about mind, because that could just be like the cat thinks that's you. You're behind the glass or something.
The cat knew I was here. If I put my hand like this, she'd walk over for a pat. She knew exactly where I was. But she also knew how to communicate with me in a secondary medium. Anyhow, so I just found that interesting. I have neither here nor there. In terms of the artist as individual, first of all, we identify certain people as artists. We don't tend to identify everybody as an artist, though it's nice and polite to sort of say that we all have some artistic ability, or we all create art when we do certain things. But it is undeniable that we identify certain individuals. We could go through this room and identify certain individuals as artists, based at least on profession, if nothing else. I have a 5-year-old son who takes art class on Granville Island, and his teacher just announced that she's taking a job at the University of Illinois teaching art. Then she took my wife and I aside and said that she'd like to write some articles about childhood art, and she'd like to use our son's examples for the article. So he's already been identified at some level as being able to say something, perhaps. But the function of the artist, socially speaking, has changed dramatically. So there's always been this concept of an individual as artist, but what's that artist's role in society? Right now, the function of the artist is to sort of stand outside society. We thought of as being perhaps a bit odd, or perhaps a bit unusual, or dropping potato chips onto the sky. But at other times in society, when we need a memorial for the Vietnam War, We choose an individual to speak for all of us, right? And I think that in 18th century culture, the artist's role was to speak for all of us. So I think that's the intersection between the group and the individual, and where art meets, is that an individual speaks for the group. I think perhaps one of the goals of this forum is to discover where that intersect sort of broke down. And it broke down, I think, perhaps at the point in which we view the artist as being an autonomous individual that it frankly does whatever he or she damn well feels like, like dumping potato chips on the sky. Does that go somewhere towards?
Yeah, it's consistent. The social role of the artist does change depending on the society within the artist. Within the artist has a social role. It's a functional relationship. How it's a systemic thing. How the institutions relate to each other, and so it's partly structural, and partly psychocultural in these these ways that very few people talk about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to speak to this first from the point of view of a 35,000-year-old history. It's very, very important because it seems like everyone in this room has lost the sense of hunting. So when we go back 35,000 years, we have to go back to hunting and gathering. For those of us who have hunted, it's very, very important to be able to anticipate the animal. So what you're looking at in those caves is an exchange of metaphors between hunters and the animals. They see themselves as the animals and the animals as themselves. That exchange of metaphors is going to allow the anticipation of the hunter to anticipate where that animal will go. And remember, this is a life and death situation in two different ways. These are big animals. These are big, deadly animals. To anticipate the animal wrong is likely to die. The animal hunts you. The concept here is that the artists that we see and in those caves are passing very special things along. Now, it's very important to also note this in the caves. Those caves, once are opened and human beings come into them, are susceptible to the destruction of carbon dioxide from breathing in and breathing out. So the caves just simply disappear. So those caves, as they are, and since the Chauvet cave, for example, exists over about 25,000 years, is art being passed from artist to artist? Because if this were being passed to the social group that was there, these things would have disappeared. So there are very few people with access to these caves. This is one of the reasons, Vaughn, why I say that this is passed from generation to generation to generation to generation, is that we know that those drawings will disappear if there is a social entity that enters that cave. And as a modern man, right now those caves are closed because as you go in and breathe in that cave, you increase the carbon dioxide and the drawings, paintings disappear. So what you can conclude from that is that in using them and carbon dating these over, the Chauvet caves, I think, went from 35,000 to 14,000. That's 20,000 years. I mean, it's unimaginable in our lifetimes that this was passed from generation of artist to generation of artist to generation of artist. That's a very important point. So that there is a subgroup that saw themselves. And all over Europe that's true, and I think we'll find those caves all over the world as we stagger onto them and stumble onto them. That there is an art history that's passed from artist to artist, generation of artist to generation to artist. Now, in those caves, it's very important to understand that that's the metaphor of the hunter. That what we're talking about in terms of art from the time of civilization to the time of agriculture is a very different picture and a very different role of the artist. The artists themselves saw the privacy and the necessity of passing that, if it were magic, whatever those metaphors and exchanges were. So it's very important not to overlay these particular things once you get to the age of agriculture. That was one aspect of
Hey,
this.
hang on, stop for a second. Recording is...
There's just a comment, actually, a question.
Oh, sorry. Can you just wait till he's finished? Yeah.
Okay, now the second part, which I would love for you and Sam to be able to get together on, and Karun has put up a gap that's absolutely enormous between you two intellectually, which I would like to see broken because I think it's ridiculous that it's there. I've had geese problems here. They're a very, very social animal, and it's a silly story, but it's a very true story that's happened. These geese were brought here. They were imprinted to this ground. They were obviously raised here, and they never migrated. They've been here now for they really, really started to inundate the place around 1994. So let's assume they've been here since 1990. Somebody raised them, hatched those eggs, and now they're in this environment. For this many years, since say 1990 till now, which is almost 20 years, they've just been in a desultory fashion, landing wherever they do, nesting wherever they do, and following out their social norms. And they are extraordinarily social. If a mother goose does not like the way a goose in that tribe is raising her children, she will just take them away. So there's so many different things going on with these animals as you observe them from up close. Now, so they were raised here, they're in a very desultory manner, settling wherever they settle in this area. Now this year, for the first time, and this was very, very, very amazing. They were starting to overpopulate here, and I've been chasing them out every morning. That's the reason why you don't see them here in big piles of shit. Now, something happened this year, which I hadn't ever seen before. I'm out working, and when they come in and they're in this mating season, they squawk. They don't honk, they don't do anything. So, one morning I was out, and a giant V had formed up, and this V is an asymmetric V with 4 outflyers. At the lead of this was a genuine honker, a male honker peninsular individual, taking them away. And I thought, okay, that's really amazing. How did they all group up? They've never done this before. They don't even know where they're going. The peninsular individual suddenly creates a migratory statement to these animals. They all have the measure all set up for this social V. Now the importance I figured out of the V is that apparently eagles will pick up even adult geese. But when they're in the V, they're probably perceived as one animal, and that's what preserves them as they go. All right, so that was one instance of it. About a week or two later, I'm visiting with some people on the south side of the island and headed north again, another whole V, some that they just picked up after they overpopulated. They formed up exactly into the right improper V and migrated. Now, this is something that is a trigger mechanism, a social trigger mechanism that gets up. It's led by a peninsular individual, so that's what made me really interested in this, because if we go back to the cave paintings, and if we go back to the conversations that we were talking about, and if we go back to the time of when, how these things are passed, the bow and arrow, for example, all around the world, then I believe there are trigger mechanisms that go on with human beings not unlike this. That would be a genetic cluster that gets up, and there's something that goes on to get these human beings to trek. After all, what have we done in the world as it is? We've trekked everywhere. That's one of the aspects there. We came out of one place, one solitary place, and we've trekked everywhere in the world. We were going to stay in places, and then all of a sudden, something is going to come to get us to migrate. Great example is settling Micronesia all the way out to Easter Island. Why? What is this thing that goes and gets us moving? I think there's a genetic set of triggers. Okay? And that genetic set of triggers also sets up an entire movement of an environment that gets us moving. And I'm only speculating on this, but this is one of the things that I like very much about the peninsular individual, because of the navigation thing that it implies, is that we learn, something comes together. Those geese were navigating. They suddenly came together on a genetic trigger, right? Because they were overpopulating this area and doing something that they socially learn everything. I've watched them. Right? They don't even know how to nest the first year. They're chased out of their nest. I'm walking and patrolling here, and the idiots will try to nest right in front of me, and they know that, literally they have no chance unless they learn that of passing their genes along to a future generation. As long as a predator, which I am seen as, is walking, they'll nest on my path. That's just moronic. I go, the known nesters go and hide and have this all figured out. They leave right away. As soon as I started chasing them last year, they just took off to Denver and they started nesting there. They knew there was a predator. Now they can nest and raise broods for up to 20 years apparently. So that's a long nesting period. So the ones that have been around for those 20 years knew, they just got out of here. The other ones are chased out of the nest and they have to learn how to actually nest and pass their eggs along. On the other hand, this coming together to migrate, that was magic. And so something triggered an announcement to them. And I've heard of the deer swimming off this island for that, people finding them out while they're fishing, the deer migrating, all of a sudden, out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. So one of the problems of dealing with chimpanzees, I just want to mention this, is that, Cro-Magnon man, the one that we're looking at, as ourselves, modern man, this brain pan, this body shape, everything else, is only 50,000 years old. The distance between us and chimpanzees could be millions and millions and millions of years. So you can see that there's like this, all of this continuum of diversion between there. So the modern chimpanzee and ourselves have developed along very, very different paths for very, very long periods of time. So I just wanted to, you can't just look at a chimpanzee and relate that to you without doing with the entire other history that goes with that. So what I would like if you two could do at some point, because I think you want to move deeply into the social reality. That's Jerry's field. He's done this for so many years. And he's done it in isolation from Darwin. The perception, in my opinion, of sociologists of Darwin is social Darwinism. It's adapted, it's taught, it's put down, and natural selection just hasn't been part of their study. Okay, I think it's time. Right, I think it's time. I know that's tough for old dogs, but I think you could teach a new dog a new trick here. I think Sam really wants this. I think Sam wants to get out of a field that is so insulated from social reality. It's so insulated from social reality, right? And I think that it's time to relate these two things. These are huge, because this migratory thing is the navigation. How the hell did they get to Easter Island? What was even the thoughts in their mind to go there? What were they thinking of? And yet, they trekked out of Africa, right? And trekked everywhere, except Antarctica, right? Trekking, they trekked. That's how they moved. Now, the importance of that is what did they bring with them in terms of their socialization? What information did they take with them? Mm-hmm. And then what cultures did they change otherwise? Then when we get to agriculture, this concept of invasion may be the extension, very much the extension of this trigger to migrate.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an awful lot of missing gaps between this issue of memes growing into something and the sociology of the things that you're talking about here. Sure. So I don't know, I just am suggesting that as a part of it.
I suggest a side meeting about that later.
We're going to end with,
very interesting, but we're going to end with Robert's comment or question.
My comment was on, Jeff was just discussing two examples that came to mind. Well, first, when you were talking about the Chauvet caves, I thought art had a meaning, that our art was survival. So that's an interesting use or a reason that it was sustained and whatever.
By the way, that remains so for artists.
Yeah, and the second thought was an instance today where people are acting somewhat like the geese or the deer are Hutterite communities, where they get to about 120 people and they split. And one of the leader's sons takes a new community out and they build another village and they resettle it. And they'll split it, they'll join some people from another one to keep the genetic diversity. And that's in practice and has been for, I'm not sure how many years. Ran into a few and spoken about it, and it's probably in a very similar way to how people spread from Africa. Little communities getting too big, new hunting grounds, could have taken thousands and thousands of years, I'm sure. But it still happens. And that's an interesting example also of a collective mindset, community living. It's very insular. I mean, they have to interact outside of that, but it's almost like a peninsular community instead of a peninsular individual. Just thoughts. No?
But they migrate with the peninsular individual.
Yes, they
You
do.
see, that's exactly what you said from the beginning, and that right, that you're confirming what Jerry is stating, which I think is a really important part of it.
Thank you. Oh, do you have one last statement, or?
I was just gonna say, what if the leader has only daughters?
Depends what
Just a
year.
thought.
I am aware that I haven't, I've been looking to see if anybody has questions. If you do, you do. Okay, well, if a brief one would be fine. If there's anybody else, let me know now so I can plan. Okay, so we have one last question from the observers.
Me?
Yeah.
You say the critique in this paper is transgressive as a method in a different register than those critiques. Can you tell me what you mean by different register?
Not briefly. Different way, different dimension.
Are you using an analogy from music? Different
Yeah, using
A
a-
register, a very simple explanation is a register on an organ is a different keyboard. Organs have 3 or 4 keyboards and a rack of pedals. To play a different register is to choose a different keyboard.
No, okay. Transgressivity is a method of thought. And postmodern philosophy and feminist philosophy are transgressive. They transgress conventions. They stick out. They innovate. They're new. They're different. They violate certain conventions of thinking in order